In a world where the heaviest burdens are often those we cannot see, Jesus teaches his disciples an unforgettable lesson: that true strength is found not in what we carry alone, but in the love and compassion we share. As each disciple faces unseen struggles, they'll come to realize that sometimes the greatest miracles lie in the simplest acts of understanding, forgiveness, and faith. Journey with them to the shores of Galilee, through tempests of doubt and storms of fear, as they discover that the lightest yoke of all is love. The morning sun had barely begun its climb over the hills surrounding the Sea of Galilee, casting a soft, golden light on the water, which lay calm and quiet, like a mirror reflecting heaven itself. The air was thick with the smell of salt and fish from the fishermen who had long since returned to shore, their nets piled on the sand, heavy with the night's catch. Jesus had called his disciples early that morning, inviting them to gather with him along the shore. One by one they appeared, sleep still in their eyes but a quiet reverence in their steps. They knew whenever Jesus called them in such a manner, it would be for something important. Peter, rugged and sturdy, was among the first to arrive. He was always ready, his face marked by sun and wind, his hands roughened from the nets he used to haul. Following him came John, younger, his eyes thoughtful and curious, his demeanor gentle compared to Peter's boldness. Behind them, Thomas trailed, looking as if he were carrying something unseen, his steps slightly slower, his gaze more distant. The others arrived shortly, each finding their place in a rough circle around Jesus, whose eyes gleamed with kindness as he watched them gather. As they settled down on the pebbled shore, some of them began to exchange quiet words, sharing stories of the past night, small complaints about the cold, or murmurs of anticipation about what Jesus might say. Yet despite the camaraderie, there was a weight among them, an invisible heaviness that Jesus could sense. He watched his disciples carefully, taking in the little details they often tried to hide. Peter's furrowed brow, John's distant gaze, and Thomas's hesitant steps. All these signs spoke to him of unseen burdens each man carried, weights they kept silent, perhaps even from themselves. When the chatter died down, Jesus spoke, his voice gentle but resonant, reaching each of them in a way that felt both personal and profound. He began to speak of burdens, of the loads each person carries in life. His words, though soft, held a mirror to their souls, and each disciple felt exposed yet comforted. Jesus didn't ask them to reveal their struggles, but he invited them to recognize them, to be aware of the weights they bore. And as he spoke, Thomas felt his own heart ache, realizing that perhaps he was not as alone as he had thought. The chapter closes with Jesus catching Thomas's eye, a silent promise passing between them that he would be seen, that his burdens too mattered. Thomas walked away from the shore, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The other disciples returned to their own tasks, but he lingered, letting the group drift ahead as he stood by himself. He watched the waves lap against the shore, rhythmic and ceaseless, almost hypnotic in their repetition. In those quiet moments, his thoughts began to turn inward, memories and fears rising unbidden. He thought of his family, of his mother and father who had reluctantly watched him leave, their eyes filled with unspoken worry. He thought of the responsibilities he'd left behind and the whispers of others who questioned his choice to follow this new path. He had always been a thoughtful, questioning man, one who weighed decisions carefully, and this path with Jesus had been the most daring step he'd ever taken. The doubts that had whispered to him from the beginning, small and soft at first, had grown louder as the journey continued. He wondered if he was strong enough, wise enough, or faithful enough to walk alongside the others. And yet, he couldn't ignore the yearning that had drawn him to Jesus in the first place. A yearning for truth, for meaning, and for a love that seemed to go beyond anything he had ever known. As he stood there, feeling the invisible weight on his heart, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his doubts set him apart from the others, that perhaps he wasn't as steadfast or as worthy. His mind turned over these thoughts, a constant cycle of questioning and second-guessing. Yet, in his heart, there was a quiet hope that one day he might find peace. He hadn't shared any of this with the other disciples. He didn't know how. They seemed so confident, so sure of their purpose, while he still felt like an outsider, clutching onto fragments of faith, praying they would be enough. The evening had settled in, painting the sky with hues of indigo and purple, and a fire crackled at the center of their small camp, casting flickering shadows on the disciples gathered around. The fire's warmth was a welcome comfort against the chill that crept in as the sun sank behind the hills. Peter, seated across from Thomas, watched him with a sharp, perceptive gaze. He had noticed Thomas's quietness, the way he had lingered by himself earlier, and though Peter was not always the most sensitive to others' emotions, he couldn't ignore the heaviness he sensed around Thomas. Peter, in his usual straightforward manner, leaned over, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Thomas," he said, his voice a mix of roughness and warmth, "you're looking as serious as a man facing a storm. What's got your mind so tangled up?" Thomas glanced up, surprised by Peter's question, and for a moment he hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. But something in Peter's tone, in the camaraderie around the fire, urged him to speak, even if only a little. "It's hard to explain," Thomas murmured, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Sometimes I wonder if I truly belong here. If I'm enough." Peter chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that was neither mocking nor dismissive. "You think we're all saints already?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "We all carry things, Thomas. Maybe not the same things, but we're all learning, stumbling just like you." He looked into the fire, his own eyes growing distant. "Don't think for a moment that I don't have doubts myself. I just don't let them see the light of day, that's all." Their conversation, laced with humor, sincerity, and unspoken understanding, brought a warmth to Thomas's heart. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't alone in his struggle. He wasn't the only one trying to keep pace on a path that often seemed beyond him. The fire crackled, the warmth reaching deeper than his skin, and Thomas found comfort in the shared silence that followed, a silence that spoke of companionship and acceptance. The following morning, the disciples gathered again, this time in the shade of a large olive tree, its leaves whispering in the breeze as they settled around Jesus, each one still holding the memories and reflections from the previous night. Jesus looked at them, his gaze calm and inviting, and without preamble, he began to tell a story. His voice, soft yet powerful, drew them in as he spoke of a man journeying through a vast desert, carrying a bag on his back that seemed light at first but grew heavier with each step. Jesus described how the man, though unaware of it, had been filling his bag with each worry, each regret, and every unspoken fear he had carried throughout his life. Invisible to those around him, this burden weighed him down, making his journey harder with each passing day. The disciples listened, their hearts stirred as they imagined the man, struggling with a weight that none could see, yet one that affected every aspect of his life. They saw themselves in the story, recognizing their own invisible burdens, the things they carried silently in their hearts. As Jesus concluded, he looked around, his eyes filled with understanding and love. He didn't explain the parable but left it hanging in the air, allowing each disciple to find their own meaning. In the quiet that followed, they felt a stirring within, a longing to be free of the weights they carried, a desire to trust that their burdens could be lifted, even if only for a moment. Each disciple walked away from that gathering a little quieter, their minds filled with thoughts of the hidden loads they had borne alone. In the following days, the disciples traveled through a nearby village, a place where John had once lived before he left to follow Jesus. As they passed familiar streets and faces, memories surfaced, bringing with them a mix of joy and pain. John had been a quiet, contemplative young man, and though he often kept his thoughts to himself, he carried a wound from his past that had never fully healed. In this village, he encountered an old acquaintance, a man who had once been a close friend but had betrayed him in a moment of weakness. The sight of the man brought a rush of emotions John had tried to forget. He remembered the hurt, the anger, and the guilt that followed, emotions he had buried deep, hoping they would fade with time. Yet here in the village of his past, those old wounds resurfaced, raw and aching. That evening, John found himself sitting alone, his heart heavy with memories and regrets. Jesus, seeing his turmoil, joined him, sitting beside him in silence. He didn't press John to speak but simply sat with him, offering his presence as a balm to the pain. After a long silence, John spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There are things I thought I had let go of, things I thought I had forgiven." Jesus listened, his gaze gentle, his presence a steady anchor. He placed a hand on John's shoulder and reminded him that forgiveness is a journey, one that sometimes takes a lifetime. In that moment, John felt a small release, a lightness that began to lift the weight he had carried for so long. Jesus' compassion brought him a step closer to healing, showing him that even the deepest wounds could find peace. The journey through villages and open fields eventually brought the disciples to a town where Mary Magdalene joined them. Her arrival shifted the group's dynamic in subtle yet profound ways. She was strong and spirited, her presence radiating a warmth and courage that few of the disciples could match. Yet Mary carried her own invisible weight, one born of a painful past and the judgments others cast upon her. She walked with a quiet resilience, but under her confidence lay a familiar ache, the deep wound of feeling unworthy, unaccepted. She often caught the stares of townsfolk as they passed, whispers rising around her like a haunting echo. Peter, outspoken and skeptical, found himself struggling with Mary's place among them. He respected her devotion, but he couldn't shake the ingrained views of his society, views that clashed with his growing understanding of compassion and acceptance. Their interactions were sometimes tense. Peter's gaze would linger too long, and his words, though unintentional, held a sting. Mary sensed his unease, and it deepened her feelings of isolation, awakening old doubts she thought she had left behind. One evening, as they gathered around the fire, Mary sat slightly apart, the warmth of the flames casting a glow on her face but unable to touch the chill within. She glanced around, watching the others laugh and talk, feeling both drawn to their camaraderie and separated by an invisible barrier. Jesus, noticing her distance, moved to sit beside her. His eyes, filled with a profound understanding, met hers, and she felt seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Mary," he began softly, his voice like a gentle balm, "do you know that you are as much a part of this journey as any of us? That the love you carry within you is a gift?" Mary's eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "But I am not like the others. They don't see me as worthy, not completely." Jesus placed a hand on her shoulder, a comforting weight. "What others see does not define your worth. Your heart, your love, your faith, they are what I see, and that is more than enough." In that moment, Mary felt a weight lift, a small piece of her burden lightening, and she began to believe that perhaps she too was deserving of acceptance and love. After leaving the village, Jesus and his disciples embarked on a journey across the Sea of Galilee, boarding a small boat under clear skies. The sun shimmered on the water, casting a tranquil beauty over the waves as they drifted further from shore. But as they sailed, the weather shifted suddenly, dark clouds gathering overhead, the peaceful waters turning turbulent. The disciples, seasoned fishermen though some were, felt a wave of fear as the boat began to toss violently. The winds howled, the sky darkened, and rain fell in stinging sheets, each drop cold against their skin. The disciples scrambled, pulling ropes and trying to steady the boat, but panic began to rise. Peter, always bold, shouted commands, but even he felt his confidence waver as the boat dipped and rocked, the waves crashing over the sides. His heart pounded with fear, a raw vulnerability he was unaccustomed to feeling. He gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white, his mind racing. What if this was the end? What if all they had sacrificed, all they had left behind, had been for nothing? Through the chaos, they noticed Jesus, sitting calmly at the back of the boat, his face serene even as the storm raged around them. Peter, nearly shouting over the roar of the storm, cried, "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" Jesus rose, his gaze steady and unwavering. With a quiet authority, he stretched out his hand, and his voice, though soft, carried a power that seemed to cut through the storm itself. "Peace, be still," he commanded, and instantly the wind ceased, the waves settled, and the sea returned to a glassy calm. The disciples stared in awe, their fear replaced by a profound reverence. Jesus turned to them, his expression gentle yet piercing. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" His words lingered in the silence, a reminder that the true storm had not been on the water but within their hearts. Each disciple felt a quiet conviction, realizing that the unseen fears they carried, the doubts that had gripped them, were perhaps more formidable than any physical storm. As they sailed on in silence, each man reflected on his own inner turmoil, understanding that faith was not merely about trust in calm waters, but in the face of life's fiercest tempests. When they reached the opposite shore, they were met by a crowd from a nearby village, where word had spread of Jesus' presence. Among the crowd was a man who had been suffering from a long illness, his body weakened, his spirit worn from years of struggle. The villagers had seen his suffering, but they could not see the depth of his despair, the silent weight he carried in his heart. He approached Jesus, his eyes filled with a desperate hope, a plea for healing that went beyond his physical ailment. Jesus looked upon the man, his gaze filled with compassion. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on the man's shoulder, and whispered a quiet prayer. In that moment, a warmth spread through the man's body, a lightness he had not felt in years. Yet, the true miracle was not just the healing of his illness, it was the release of the hidden burdens he had carried for so long. The fear, the shame, the feeling of being unseen and unheard. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that he had been touched in a way that went beyond the physical. Jesus had seen him, truly seen him, and in that recognition he felt whole. The disciples watched, each moved by the depth of this healing. They realized that the greatest miracles were not always visible, that healing often began within, with the release of unseen wounds. As they left the village, their hearts were filled with a new understanding of compassion, a desire to reach others in ways that went beyond the surface. They began to see that to follow Jesus was to touch hearts, to bring light to hidden darkness, and to ease the invisible burdens others carried. As they journeyed onward, Jesus took a quiet moment with Thomas by the shore. The air was cool, the water calm, and the only sound was the soft lapping of waves against the rocks. Jesus turned to Thomas, his expression kind but serious, as if he knew the thoughts that had been troubling him. "Thomas," he said gently, "I want you to hold out your hand." Thomas obeyed, his brow furrowing in confusion as Jesus acted as though he were placing something in his hand. The other disciples watched in silence, sensing that something profound was taking place. Jesus looked into Thomas's eyes, his voice soft yet full of meaning. "Do you feel it, Thomas? The weight you carry, the doubts, the worries, the fears, imagine it resting in your hand." Thomas closed his eyes, and as he concentrated, he could almost feel the invisible burden, a heaviness pressing down on him. He thought of his own insecurities, his fears of not being enough, the doubts he struggled to silence. For a moment, the weight felt overwhelming, an accumulation of all the burdens he had carried silently. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, Jesus placed his own hand over Thomas's open palm. "You do not have to carry this alone," he whispered. "I am here always to share this weight with you." A tear slipped down Thomas's cheek as he felt the warmth of Jesus' hand, a comfort that penetrated to the deepest corners of his heart. In that moment, something shifted within him, a lightness replacing the weight he had held so tightly. He realized that faith did not mean the absence of doubts. It meant allowing those doubts to be lifted, to trust that he was not alone in his journey. As they stood by the shore, Thomas felt a peace he had never known, a release of burdens that had clung to him for so long. He looked at Jesus, his heart overflowing with gratitude, and knew that this moment had changed him forever. He would carry this memory, this feeling, as a reminder that he was seen, loved, and unburdened. In the quiet of the morning, as the disciples gathered one last time with Jesus by the shore, he spoke to them with a love that seemed to wrap around each of them, a love that made the air itself feel lighter. "My beloved friends," he began, his voice tender and filled with affection, "you have walked with me, seen miracles, learned lessons, and shared in the struggles of this journey. But I tell you now, the greatest calling you will ever have is to love one another, to carry each other's burdens, even those you cannot see." He looked at each disciple in turn, his gaze holding their own, as though he were reaching into their very souls. The invisible burdens of the heart, those fears, those regrets, the shame that weighs us down, these are the heaviest of all. And yet, when you walk with compassion, when you choose to see one another truly, you will lift those burdens, and in doing so, you will find your own heart unburdened. The disciples listened, their hearts stirred, realizing that this was the essence of everything they had learned. It was not only about grand miracles or powerful words, it was about the quiet moments, the acts of kindness, the willingness to see beyond what was visible. They knew that Jesus had given them more than teachings. He had given them a way to live, a way to love. As the sun rose higher, casting its light over the water, each disciple felt a quiet resolve, a renewed purpose. They would go forward, not only as followers of Jesus but as bearers of his love, his compassion, and his understanding. And as they left the shore, their hearts were lighter, their spirits lifted, carrying with them the message that to truly love is to lift the weightless burdens others carry. And in that love, they found a peace that would stay with them, a peace that would guide them as they walked the path Jesus had shown them. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.